I'm Tony Ruiz, contributing editor at Gold Derby, here with Sam Clemmett, who stars as the young Brimsley in Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story. And Sam, you know, there's so many things that I want to talk about with this particular character, but the one thing that I want to start with is this is a character whose entire job it is to support and observe. And
Uh-huh.
so much of what you have to do in this role is nonverbal. And
hmm
I'm curious if that's even to a certain extent more challenging than, big dramatic moments.
Yeah, I think it is. Actually, it was one of the parts or the aspects of the performance that I think I was most nervous about because we become very adept as actors to handle dialogue, and the moments that we're not talking, it's all about, okay, how can I remain active? So, um, yeah, I think to begin with, I did find it quite challenging and more challenging than other aspects of the performance. But I think as we started to, well, we got deeper into the shooting of the whole series, I started to understand that language of not being able to have an opinion verbally, but still being able to drop into him as a human being and for him to have opinions for himself. And the more I think I led into that, the more I found it easy to, I don't know, find that storytelling within the non-verbal moments. But it's definitely something it took me a while to get used to because that was very new to me in storytelling.
One of the things that I think is the physicality, the relationship between Charlotte and Brimsley is so much unstated and yet is so present in the physicality. I'm thinking specifically of, you walking behind her and just putting up your hand.
Yeah.
It's one of the most touching scenes. How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, it's that scene is really been, people have been very moved by that scene, which I'm delighted with. When we first got episode 5, it was a very small piece of action that Shonda Rhimes wrote in, and me and India both weren't quite sure how that was going to work out. But she specifically said she wanted it to be some sort of tableau. And we turned up on the day, and it ended up being a much more emotionally draining 4 hours of filming than we were expecting. And the more we were getting into the crux of what that moment is, when we were working closely with our director Tom Verica, it became clear that this is the moment that solidifies their relationship. They could finish each other's sentences if they want to, but they don't. But they know where each other are at emotionally, physically at any point, and I think that is the foundation of who they become in their older years with the likes of Golda and Hugh, who play the older versions of the character. That solidifies who they are as an item, I suppose.
But what is it about Charlotte that attracts Brimsley, that makes this more than just being a servant?
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, I think not a lot because I think he's so ready for this moment and has been waiting for to be able to serve someone his entire life. He's grown up in the courts, but uh, when it comes to having to serve her and understanding her and seeing her at her most vulnerable, he sees someone that is deeply isolated. And for me, a huge aspect of Brimsley's emotional core is how he himself is also very isolated. On his downtime, the only other person he can confide in is Reynolds, be that physically, be that emotionally. And so I think him witnessing this isolation that she's being drawn into, and as the story progresses, realizing that what, she's going to have a lifetime of this, but I can see the loyalty and the dedication that she has got to this man and to the crown, that I will stand by this woman come what may. And there's sort of this, again, unspoken bond. They make this sort of pinky promise to each other, as it were, without saying anything, because they are united in their isolation hugely. So I think that's a huge um, thing that he sees in her that he holds on to.
I also think that it's a credit to the writing and a credit to the performances that it happens so gradually that at one point I remember watching the series. I've gone through the series twice now, and I cannot pick the exact moment where it crosses over from where the bond truly is there. It's like all of a sudden it's just there at some point. And I don't. How much conversation did you and India have about there being a switch between just servant and queen and that bond?
It's funny. Yeah, it's funny because you shoot everything out of sequence. Like at the beginning of shooting, we started with episode 2 because of the locations. We're a hugely location-led set, and so when we then got to shooting stuff in episode 1, we'd had like 3 weeks of filming under our belt. So it was from the offset. It was a conversation we had from the rehearsals, and I don't necessarily think there was a moment which we pointed out ourselves, and I think that's absolutely up for the viewer to find that and take that from the show if they can find it. But what we wanted to do throughout, and we had this conversation with Tom Verica, was to thread that line of, okay, when can we push beyond the boundaries of just being a servant? When can he try and instill some sort of advice or knowledge without directly having to tell her what to do, or without being able to have some sort of emotional connection or a vulnerability or an opinion on something? And it's them moments that we have throughout, and they're very small and they're very subtle. But I think it's for Brimsley anyway. He's very, very tactful. He's a brilliant tactician in the fact that he knows the moments he can push the boundaries to help her and to guide her for the sake of not just the crown, but for their relationship and the longevity of their relationship. And I think the more that happens, the more that relationship and foundation is just sort of solidified. So when we get to that moment of, the hand goes up, we're like, oh, of course this was always going to happen. He was always going to be there to pick her up when she's about to fall. Even if he can't physically, he's going to be there. So yeah, it was more of an ongoing conversation rather than turning up and going, okay, this is the moment, because I just don't think that's possible within his role.
Well, and I think it also it foreshadows, something we see in one of the later episodes between Golda and Hugh, where, the queen turns to him and says, "Did you never marry, Brimsley?" And, as a viewer, you're like, wait a minute, she's just now noticing that. It's almost like a shock. It's like a push and pull almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Every time I talk about that moment, I think of, when Hugh opens up and it's like you hear a crack in his voice and he just goes, well, how could I ever have a lifetime with anyone? You're the person that I'm here to spend my life with. That breaks my heart every time I think about it.
And then of course, there's the Reynolds and Brimsley relationship, which felt to me so lived in and so authentic, and not just a throwaway. Was it all in the writing?
I mean, yeah. I think Shonda's writing is so rich. You can take so much from it. There's so much on the page to play with, but as well as that, we had a creative team on board and it is the most collaborative process I've ever had on from a screen perspective, because a lot of the time you have no time to rehearse, and you turn up, you've got to get the stuff that you need to get, and we move on. But Tom Verica is not just our director of all 6 episodes, but he's the executive producer, and he's almost her right-hand man and his right-hand woman. So they can almost somewhat finish each other's sentences, and they trust each other implicitly. And Shonda gives these such rich characters and these rich scripts, but then also says to Tom, but find other nuances and sort of run wild with it, I suppose. So yes, it was all of it was in the writing, but we had the artistic freedom to really play and to dig deeper and to ask more questions about these two. And one of the things I was scared of when you get the job and you sign on to something, and there's only a couple of episodes that have been written at that point, I was like, is this just going to be a servant butler kind of role, and it's yes, your majesty, 3 bags full, your majesty, for 6 episodes? And it really wasn't that. We really started to see the humanity behind these people, these 2 young men that lead very isolated lives because of their job. And not only were we able to dig into that within the Queen and Brimsley and the King and Reynolds, but we really started to see the more personal and intimate and deeply vulnerable side of the two of them through this relationship. So yes, we had some fantastic dialogue heavy scenes for the two of us, but there's also, again, a lot played in the non-verbal communication and the looks that go on between Reynolds and Brimsley, which I really do think speak 1,000 words. You know, these two men that are being denied the opportunity to express their love for each other and live the life that they want to live for each other because of their dedication to the crown. So yes, it's all in the writing, of course, but because of the creative team we had, we were able to just really, really play, which is a joy.
But there's also, I think there's a strange mirroring that almost happens between, Charlotte and George's relationship and Reynolds and Brimsley, because, Charlotte doesn't necessarily know the extent of what's going on with George, and Brimsley is trying to get that information, and Reynolds isn't really giving it to him. And, it creates like this really kind of universal conflict that makes both couples kind of on equal footing, which I think is just fascinating.
Totally, absolutely. Because I mean, yes, you've got the monarchy, and they are at the top of the top, and I suppose we are much more towards the bottom. But at the end of the day, human beings are human beings. Love is love, and we all deal with things in a universal way. Regardless of what class you might be from and how you might identify. All human beings are wired the same way. The way is how I see it. Yes, we are all very, very different, and we all work very differently. But essentially, we all have the same kind of vessel, and things manipulate very differently. And I just think our series brings it back down to, it's a story about love and relationships and human beings and behavior. And that's something that I'm always drawn to as an actor. These stories that are hugely character driven. I find that more interesting than anything, because it gives the opportunity for people to see themselves on screen, and it's not just about a good plot and a good story. It's characters that have to drive that. And then when it comes to talking about love, we are all human beings. We all deal with things in a very similar way. We all deal with universal things, which we see in this show. So regardless of being at the top or under the grounds of the palace, there is an equal playing field there, which I think is a really beautiful aspect of our story.
Which I think is perfectly encapsulated in that scene in the bathtub, which is not so much about them being together. It's the conversation of, yes, it is possible. That was one of my favorite lines of the whole show.
It's possible if you want it that badly, and love isn't easy. Love is hard. But it's reflected in our relationship, in the King and the Queen's relationship. But it's worth fighting for. It's worth fighting for, and that's it's that line. It's the dancing between Brimsley and Reynolds at the end. It's the scene under the bed at the end when he recognizes her and goes, "God, you didn't." I mean, just thinking about it now gives me goosebumps. You didn't jump over the wall, because it's worth fighting for, and that's what's so beautiful about this story.
From an acting standpoint, how much did you observe Hugh as the older Brimsley, and how conscious were you of trying to take in some of those characteristics, or did you just want to approach it fresh?
I mean, I think I left that door open for myself, because I wanted to meet Hugh and be in a room with Hugh and Tom before making any of them decisions. Obviously, I was having lots of ideas. But we're also coming into a world that is already quite established, and we share our character. So I met Hugh on the first read through, and he came up to me and gave me a big hug and immediately put me at ease, and all my nerves went away. And he just shared a lot of the stuff that he created over the last 3 years of doing Bridgerton. He self-professes that he doesn't have very much to do, so it was up to him to really start to paint a picture. So he could ground himself in his reality, in Brimsley's reality. And he said, but you don't have to take any of this. This is just what I've come up with. And a lot of it I found very, very helpful. And I did pick bits from it. but both him and Tom said, but you've got a blank canvas. You know, you're creating the beginning of this man's life that became the person that Hugh has begun to create. So it's almost for you to see all that and establish all that in your head as sort of the goal, I suppose. But then I then sort of joined the dots, I suppose, is the best way I could put it. One thing I did really find helpful, and was one of my ways into the character initially, was the physicality and how Hugh holds himself within a scene when he's not talking, when he's not moving, and that sort of very resolute nature that he has, even though he's probably been beaten down and trodden over for the last 40 years of the monarchy. He's still there, and he's still maintaining the reflection of what it is to be part of the crown, I suppose. And that was something that I made sure I emulated on a day-to-day basis. But then after that, it was a case of being informed by it, but then being given the freedom to make my own choices, which is a joy.
How many different scenarios have you come up with in your head about what the future looks like between Reynolds and Brimsley?
Oh, I mean, me and Freddie have discussed it a lot. Barbados or in the Maldives, having a nice long lie down. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. One of the things that we have definitely established, and between Freddie and Hugh and myself, is that they are very much in love with each other, and they desire each other deeply. And even though he's not present in the Bridgerton world as we see it at the moment, that there is a deep connection there, and that they love each other very, very much. And I hope that one day we find out what happens to him and what happens to the two of them and where they end up. But that's one thing that we've definitely clung on to.
Well, I mean, the show is just a smashing success and very heartfelt, and I hope people continue to check it out. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Emmys, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders throughout the season. Sam Clemmett of Queen Charlotte, a very great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
And you, thank you so much.